everyone, Jolene here from Bookworm Adventure Girl. Welcome back, and if you are new, thanks for checking out my channel. Please hit subscribe and stick around. Today I am doing part 2 of celebrating 44 and 22. So some of you already know that last week I did the birth year tag. It was my birthday week and I turned 44 and 22. So I decided to celebrate and by sharing 22 5-star fiction books and 22 5-star non-fiction books that have had some kind of impact on my life. So this list is the non-fiction list, and I will leave a link to the fiction list if you are interested in checking that out. So with these lists, I don't include children's books or middle grade books. For this one, I am going back to books that I read beginning, I was probably about 14. And I am going to, maybe 15, and I'm going to share them in publication order, just as I did with the fiction list, because it just helps me have some kind of organization. So, like my fiction list, there are 3 books that were published before I was born. So I'm going to begin in 1969, when Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings was published. And I was in my grade 13 English class. So yes, in Ontario, back in the day, they had grade 13. That's how old I am. My teacher was Mr. O'Neill. And for one of our assignments, we were allowed to choose a book that we were interested in. And I chose Makes Me Want to Holler by Nathan McCall. And it had been a book that I had picked up randomly out of chapters. And when I told Mr. O'Neill, he said okay, but then he pushed me a little bit and he said, why don't you pair it with I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. And I liked the sound of the title, and I had never heard of Maya Angelou before. And that assignment and Maya Angelou have always just stuck with me. So I went on to read most of Maya Angelou's autobiographies, and we'll hopefully be doing some rereading with her soon. So, and Nathan McCall's book, from what I remember, was also good. I believe I gave it 4 stars, so it doesn't make this list, but that's okay. Next up, if you've been following my channel for a little while, then you won't be surprised that I have a Margaret Atwood book on this list, and that is Survival. It was published in 1972, and I read it as part of my Mondays with Margaret series. This book was one of the, I think it was the first book about Canadian literature that was accessible to the average reader. It wasn't an academic kind of thing. So as someone who tries to highlight Canadian literature and tries to have my finger on the pulse of, CanLit and Canadian writers, this book was very eye-opening in a couple of ways. Like, 1, it gave me a history of Canadian literature, and then 2, it now helps me recognize Canadian literature and the themes that are important in CanLit. So in general, and loosely speaking, I guess, you could say that anything that is written by a Canadian writer is CanLit. But in reality, it's really much more complex than that. And not all Canadian books would make it into the canon of Canadian literature. I will leave you a link to the video where I talk about this book in way more detail. Okay, the last book that was published before I was born was published in 1974, and that is Alive by Piers Paul Reed. This is the story of a plane crash in the Andes Mountains in 1972. And many passengers were members of a rugby team from Uruguay, and their families were also on the plane. 16 of the 45 passengers and crew on board survived, and they were on the mountain for like 2.5 months until 2 of the men went in search of help and, against all odds, managed to get rescued. And the story is about how they dealt with everything, weather, hunger, sickness, and the difficult decision to eat some of the dead. So I've read a number of books about this, and I think I still have another one actually on my shelf that I need to get to. Plus I have seen the movie, many times, but it's a story that I find fascinating, and I talk about this book a little bit, and a few of these books actually on the list, in a video that I did a long time ago called Captivating Reads, which was stories about people in captivity. So I will leave a link to that video as well if you're interested in that kind of thing. Okay, so moving into the 80s is a book that I've mentioned a few times, and even recently in a tag video, and that is The Stranger Beside Me by Ann Rule. This was published in 1980. So Ann Rule knew the serial killer Ted Bundy because they had worked together on a suicide prevention line. And she tells this story of how she came to realize that he was, in fact, the serial killer, the man who had killed like over 30 young girls. This book is so well written and it's riveting, and I've mentioned it before that this is the book that I read shortly after buying my first home, and I had to sleep with every light on in the house for 2 nights. No other book has had an impact on me quite like that. So this next book was published in 1986, and it's Life with Billy by Brian Vallee. I first learned of this story in my grade 12 sociology class. We were learning about domestic violence, and my teacher, Mrs. McNorgan, showed us the movie. And when I was visiting my aunt, who used to read, or still probably does, read tons, and my uncle, a few weeks later, I was at their house, and I was supposed to be visiting them, but I ended up reading this entire book because my aunt had it on her shelf. And again, it was a riveting story to me. Jane Stafford marries her husband Billy, and he begins to abuse her emotionally, psychologically, physically, and sexually. And the details of this are sickening and disgusting, and yes, there is a part of me that cheered when Jane shot Billy. So that's not a spoiler, it's on the back of the book. I'm not sure if this book is even still in print, and there was a sequel called Life After Billy, because the story continues with the consequences and fallout and how Jane deals with things afterwards and how she endures. So maybe one day I will find a copy at a used bookstore or something, because I don't think either one of them are in print anymore. So next up is Ryan White, My Own Story, which was published in 1991. And I've talked about this book before too, when I did a video on memoirs. So I will leave a link to that video in the description box below as well. This is the story of a young boy who contracted AIDS through a bad blood transfusion. Ryan had hemophilia, and when his school found out that he had AIDS, he was no longer allowed to go to school. So you have to remember, this story was huge in the mid-late 80s, and that's when AIDS was considered a death sentence, and there were so many misunderstandings and stereotypes and myths surrounding it. And I was always so impressed with how Ryan handled himself as such a young man. And you know, this is really going to show my age, but he did an interview on the Phil Donahue show, and it blew my mind. So this is a good book to pick up. The next book is Dead Man Walking by Helen Prejean, which was published in 1993. And I had seen this movie with Susan Sarandon and Sean Penn when it first came out, and I knew that it was a powerful story. Then when I was 18, I did a 2-week service program with the Sisters of St. Joseph. And as part of that program, we had a movie night, and the movie was Dead Man Walking. So Helen Prejean is a sister of St. Joseph, so the connection, it does make sense. That summer, on my trip to Alaska, I picked up the book, and I read it while I was staying in a hostel in Juneau, Alaska. And shortly after that, I had the opportunity to hear Helen Prejean speak, and then since then have heard her speak several times. I've had dinner with her, and she's just a very interesting woman, and I've followed the amazing work that she does. So if you've seen the movie, Sean Penn's character, in the movie he's Matthew Poncelet, but he's really a compilation character of real people. So in the book, it's about Patrick Saunier and Robert Lee Willie, And these were the first two men that Helen Prejean was a spiritual director for before their execution. So this story continues to stay with me, and I think that I talk about this book maybe in the memoirs video as well, so you can check that out. I don't remember what I say, but speaking of picking up books in Alaska, so this next book I also picked up in Alaska, and that's Into the Wild by John Krakuer. This was published in 1996, and that was the year that I took a bus across Canada to hike in Alaska for 6 weeks on my own. And while traveling like that, you know, you meet some very interesting people, and being on a bus for 4 days and 4 nights means that a lot of people are, you know, constantly coming on the bus and getting off the bus. And so at one point, somewhere, I don't know, between Toronto and the Yukon, I think it was somewhere in Manitoba, this woman gets on and she sits beside me, and she said, "I can't believe that I'm going to be on this bus for 4 hours." And I thought, you know, I've already been on it for like a couple days by this point. So I asked her where she was going, and then she asked me where I was going, and realized I had a much longer journey. So she was quiet about that. But when I told her my plans to hike in Alaska, she looked at me so terrified and shocked that I was by myself. And I assured her I was prepared and I had everything that I needed. And you know, this was before cell phones, and really the internet was still fairly new. But I had my pack, my tent, my maps, first aid. You know, I had planned well, I think. Then she told me about a book that she had just read, and she hoped that I didn't end up like him. And that book, of course, was Into the Wild, the story of Christopher McCandless. And Chris McCandless, you know, left everything behind. He goes to Alaska to live off the land. He finds shelter in an old abandoned bus that had been used by hunters. But then, unfortunately, he makes some, you know, decisions, and he dies alone. And I picked up the book, and so had many other hikers at the time. So that story and that trip have always been kind of intertwined for me. As you can see, I survived my Alaska adventure, but I did almost freeze one night, but I will save that story for another time. Okay. This next book I mentioned in a tag not too long ago, and that is The Secret Language of Eating Disorders by Peggy-Claude Pierre. This was published in 1997, and I read this shortly after it was published, and the thing that has always kind of stuck with me was the passion and dedication that Peggy and her husband had to help their 2 daughters, and other people. And so when they had a hard time finding proper care and help for their daughters who suffered from eating disorders, Peggy realized that more was going on, and they founded the Montreux Counseling Center, I think it is. And what I found most important about this book was the psychology, I guess, of what goes on in someone's mind when they have an eating disorder, and how their mind is kind of playing tricks on them. So nothing else that I have ever read had described it quite like this before. And now when I looked up this book for this video, I found some disappointing information, and it turns out that I have more reading to do on this, because there seems to have been some major issues with the counseling center, and it is now closed. They closed it down, and some of the things that I read, you know, were that people were upset that she never had the educational background. But if you read the book, like, I didn't find that surprising. I thought that was pretty clear, and I always just saw it as her story about a mother helping her children. And however, some of the things that I did read were upsetting with regard to how people were treated, and so that was bad. But there is another book out by Barbara McClintock, I think it is, called Anorexia's Fallen Angel, which is supposed to tell more of this story. So I have some catching up to do with regard to this. But I will say that, you know, I know this book was a huge deal when it did come out, and it has helped many people to at least some degree. So next up is a book that might be considered, I think it would be considered a modern classic, Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom. This was published in 1997, And this is the story of how Mitch Albom reconnects with his college professor, Morrie Schwartz, after Morrie is diagnosed with ALS. And Mitch visited him every Tuesday and then shares the lessons that he learned from his mentor in this book. It's a really sweet story in itself, and it's a quick read. But I think that I really connected with this story because I used to spend every Saturday with my Baba growing up, and I didn't live near my grandmothers, my blood grandmothers growing up, and Baba lived across the street from our house, and we kind of adopted each other, and we had a very special relationship. And when we moved across town, I would ride my bike to Baba's house every Saturday, and those were very special times and continue to be very some of my fondest memories. So this book in many ways, reminds me of that relationship. Next up is The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, and this is by Dominique Bauby, which was published in 1997. Now, if you already know Jean Bauby's story, then you might not be surprised that I thought it deserved 5 stars just for the energy and how it was written. Like, the energy that it would have taken to write this book is phenomenal. Bauby was 43 in 1995 when he had a stroke. And when he woke up several weeks after the stroke, he was completely paralyzed except for his left eyelid. He had what they call locked-in syndrome. So one of the fascinating things about this book is that he wrote it by blinking his left eye when, someone said the correct letter of the alphabet. So, can you imagine? So just with that, I had to read this book, and it is worth reading. So next up is We Wish to Inform You That We Will Be Killed with Our Families, and this is by Philip Gourevitch, which was published in 1998. Many of you already know that I am very interested in Rwanda and the people of Rwanda, and I had the opportunity to travel to Rwanda in 2014 to visit the memorials and to hear people's stories of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis. That took place over 100 days in Rwanda. So this book was one of the first books that I read about the genocide, and I think remains one of the best ones to date, in my opinion. He also has a new book coming out this year or next year. I don't know. I keep seeing different dates for this book, but the book is about how the Rwandan people have, continued to live as neighbors, and in many cases they live alongside the people who killed their family members, their friends, or in some cases attempted to kill them. So that book is very high on my list because I was very impressed with his 1998 book. Published in 1998 is Forgiving the Dead Man Walking, and this is by Debbie Morris. So I've already mentioned Dead Man Walking by Helen Prejean, and I mentioned that one of the men in that book was Robert Lee Willie. And Debbie Morris was kidnapped, raped, and tortured by Robert Lee Willie, but she survived, and she was able to save the life of her boyfriend at the time, too. And this is her side of the story and her reactions to the movie, and Helen Prejean are also part of it, so it's worth checking out if you're interested in that story. Up next is another book that I talked about in the Captivating Reads video. I Know My First Name is Stephen by Mike Echols, which was published in 1999. And this is the story of the kidnapping of Stephen Stainer and his life after he helps another boy escape. The story is tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy. I still have the book about Stephen's brother, Carrie, to read, and I will get to it when I can take that kind of book again, because I don't want to I don't want to sleep with all of the lights on again. Okay, so after so many heavy books, I have a feel-good story next. Life is So Good by George Dawson. This was published in 2000. This is a quick read and a heartwarming story in many ways. George Dawson is 103 when he tells this story about his family and how he learned to read at the age of 98. I just loved George, and I remember that he had hot chocolate and I think it was cinnamon raisin toast maybe for breakfast every day, and I thought, that's my kind of guy, you know. So this is a lovely story if you have time for it. Next is the only author to make both the fiction and nonfiction lists, and that is Elizabeth Gilbert. Eat, Pray, Love was published in 2006, and I immediately fell in love with this book because it's about traveling and eating and spirituality and relationships, and in many ways that's kind of my life. That's not, you know, how I see my life, and I can relate to it a lot. So that was before it became the big hyped book that it turned into. So I read this book before Oprah Winfrey got her hands on it, and I think in some ways, you know, it kind of turned into something that it wasn't for me originally when I first read it. So it also introduced me to Elizabeth Gilbert's writing, and so far I have enjoyed the books of hers that I've read, and I really, actually I have several more that I really need to get to. They've been sitting on my shelf for a little too long. Okay, now we are going back into some heavier stuff. Left to Tell by Immaculee Ilibagiza was published in 2006. And this is, I think, the first book that I read about Rwanda that was a personal account. So how people survive, you know, horrendous situations has always fascinated me, which you can probably tell by this most interesting list of books. Immaculee survived the genocide hidden in a tiny, cramped bathroom for over 90 days with 7 other women. And this is the story of her family, most of whom were killed, and how she herself was being hunted, and she could actually hear the killers outside the bathroom. I have read several of Immaculee's books, and she's an incredible woman, so it's worth checking out too. Up next is Columbine by Dave Cullen, which was published in 2009. I waited a long time to read this book because I knew it had potential to really shake me, which of course it did. I don't think that I have to explain much about this story, but I will say that this book I thought was so well written and gives several perspectives of what happened in April of 1999 in a high school that continues to live the consequences of this shooting. I also know that Sue Klebold has written a book, and she's the mother of one of the shooters, but I haven't had the chutzpah to pick that up yet. So if you've read that one, let me know in the comments if you think I should add it to my TBR list. Okay, we are getting near the end here. So at number 19 is The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. This was published in 2010. When I moved to Niagara in 2011, I started a book club a few months later called The Book Broads, and that book club is still going, but this was our inaugural book, and we all really enjoyed it. The story in many ways still boggles my mind, and I really commend Rebecca Skloot for having the curiosity to look deeper into this and for bringing this story to the world's attention. So Henrietta Lacks was a poor Black woman who was diagnosed with cervical cancer, and her cells grew so quickly, and doctors took her cells without her knowing, without permission, without her knowing, and they grew them. And those cells still exist today. They're known as HeLa cells, and they have contributed to medicine in considerable ways, most recently with the development of COVID-19, the vaccines. So it's extraordinary, and it's sad because the medical industry has made gazillions of dollars off of this woman's cells, and the Lacks family got nothing, and I just think that everyone should know this story. And number 20 is A House in the Sky by Amanda Lindhout. This was published in 2013. And this is a memoir which might also be in one of the other videos. I think so, in one of the videos that I've mentioned. So if it's not, it should be. And I also think that my book club read this as one of their selections too. I remember having a conversation with them. So Amanda Lindhout was a cocktail waitress at one time here in Calgary, and she would save up to travel, and she began to make a career for herself as a television reporter. And when she traveled to Somalia in 2008, she was kidnapped and held hostage for 480 days. This book is so well written. It creates a vivid picture of what is happening, and because of that, it is both compelling, and at times it was necessary for me to just put it aside, put it down for a bit. This book did get some recognition, but I still think it's so underrated. If you get a chance to read it, please do. Okay, 2 more. Educated by Tara Westover was published in 2018. This book has received a lot of hype, and I think deservedly so. I had a number of people recommend it to me before I finally picked it up. And then when I did pick it up, I was so surprised at how much I loved it. Tara tells about her childhood growing up in Idaho. Her parents were, or are, survivalists, I guess, and they lived in isolation in the mountains. The kids didn't go to school. They didn't really do homeschooling, and they didn't follow government rules and policies. And I would also say that there is mental illness within the family. So while telling some of situations and dangerous things that happened with the children because of the parents. So Tara also talks about her desire to learn, and it isn't until she is well into her teenage years that she goes to an actual school, and she shares what a culture shock that was, and how, you know, she now has several degrees. So I feel like everyone has already read this book, but if you haven't, then it's definitely worth picking up. And finally, I am going to end the list with my most recent nonfiction read, and that is The Betrayal of Anne Frank by Rosemary Sullivan, and this was just published earlier this year. Now, I gave this book 5 stars, not because, you know, the writing was so amazing or anything like that. It's not horrible, but it's very fact-based, and because of that can be dry at times. But it needs to be fact-based because of what it is, and you know, knowing most of the story already, I think definitely helps. So I talk about this more in my last wrap-up video, but basically, if you were like me and thought that we would never know for sure who actually betrayed the people in the annex, then this book gives a very concrete answer while explaining why it can't be what some of the theories have been, or that we've thought all along. So I'm not going to give it away, and I'm not sure that the final conclusion is even really surprising, although maybe. But what I thought most amazing, and I think I mentioned this in my wrap-up as well, is that Otto Frank, so Anne Frank's father, and Miep-Gys, who helped hide the people in the annex, they knew who the person was all along. And it's really because of them, although they never told anyone outright, it's because of them and advanced technology that this cold case is now considered closed. It's solved. So that is my list of 22 nonfiction books, and the end of part 2 of celebrating turning 44 in 22. So as I mentioned, if you are interested in checking out the 22 fiction books that I shared, I will leave that link below as well. And hopefully you will have, you know, found maybe 1 or 2 books that are new to you and that you are interested in. So please let me know if you have read any of these books or if you are interested in any of them. Also, let me know what nonfiction books, you know, that you would maybe add to the list. Some people have given me some recommendations, some fiction recommendations, and I love getting your recommendations. So I look forward to chatting with you in the comments. Thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and don't forget to make every day an adventure.